On behalf of the Vijay Nambisan Trust, I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to this evening's memorial lecture. Vijay Nambisan, poet, journalist, writer, a passionate advocate of the humanities, believing in the pursuit of the essential goodness that is in all of us. The Vijay Nambisan Trust was set up in 2018 to promote and support the cause of humanities by addressing issues which are of value to the individual and the society. This memorial lecture is held by the Trust annually since 2018, except for the 2 COVID years of 2020 and 21. This is the second lecture being held in Bangalore at the BIC. The Trust also awards a poetry fellowship annually to an established poet or promising new talent from India. The selected poet is offered a 2-week writing retreat at Sangam House, Pondicherry. This evening, we are fortunate to have with us Aakar Patel, author and well-known columnist. He really needs no introduction to the urban literate Indian. Some of his books include Why I Write, Our Hindu Rashtra, What It Is and How We Got Here, The Anarchist Cookbook. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on the individual in a majoritarian state. Ladies and gentlemen, Aakar Patel.
Thank you to the Trust for calling me. Thank you to BIC for hosting the event. Thank you above all to all of you for coming. And I keep saying this more than I should, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to find fora to speak on the sorts of subjects that some of us speak on. And I'm grateful that I have the opportunity to speak to you and that we have a space that we can discuss the sorts of things that hopefully you and I will talk about today. I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then maybe we can have a discussion after that. I'll begin with the idea of Indian exceptionalism. I think that for me, I'm 52 years old. For many decades, people of my generation, and perhaps also the one before mine, certainly the one that is current, feel that India is in some ways different from the rest of South Asia, that we are destined in many ways for success. And this is based not only on the idea that constitutionally and in terms of government structure, we have something superior to the rest of South Asia and perhaps also the rest of the developing world, but also historically, this is the tryst that we are meant to meet, that we will meet with our destiny and that destiny will be positive. If we look at the numbers, perhaps the story does not reflect this optimism. And I'll go through a few numbers here. India historically has doubled its per capita income, if we look at US dollars, current US dollars, every 12 years. So in 1960, which is when the World Bank began to gather data, India was at $82, which is the same as the then East Pakistan and West Pakistan. All three nations recently divided were at about $80 each. China was at $89, not too far ahead. What has happened in the 60 years since to the data that takes us to 2020, it shows that India is at roughly about $2,000. Bangladesh is slightly ahead of us, Pakistan slightly behind, but we are more or less in that same bracket. We've remained in that same bracket for the last 60 years. China, which was slightly behind us in 1990. So 1991 is the period. I was 21 years old when Manmohan Singh made his liberalization speech. And I think I was in a club playing badminton. And I put my racket down and I began to listen to what he was saying. Because even though I was young and I didn't sort of fully understand the nature of the shift, it was manifest to me and to many others that this was something markedly different from what we had heard in the decades before. Perhaps it is the case that indeed that year was a departure and we are a very different country now than we were then. Do the numbers really reflect that? I think that is the question to be asked. In 1990, we were slightly ahead of China. So $367 per capita, World Bank figures again. And the World Bank doesn't gather its own data. It all comes from the government of India. And $317 for China. So $50 behind us per capita in 1990. Today, India at 2,000, China at 12,500. So 6 times ahead of us. Not showing any sign of reducing that gap. I think that one thing that I am surprised by, having written columns for the so-called pink newspapers, the financial papers, is how little attention there is in India, including in the journalistic community, to decadal progress. We are stuck just like the CEOs and the CFOs here in quarterly results. We don't seem to look at what is happening to our country and to our neighborhood over decades, and certainly I don't think there are too many people who look at it over 6 decades. So if you look at the data since 1960, Korea was roughly 2 times ahead of us in 1960, $158. We are at 82 again. Today, Korea is at $31,000. So what was a gap of 1:2 then has become 1:15 now. Japan was at 568, 7, 8 times ahead of us, today at 40,000. What has happened is that between 1960 and 2020, and certainly between 1960 and I would say about 2005, these 3 nations began to double, sometimes triple their average per capita GDP over 2 decades. And to repeat what I said a while earlier, we, historically speaking, have been doubling every 12 years. So you're looking at nations that are tripling their income consistently over decades, which we have never actually managed to do. And the reason why we are where we are today is that we haven't been able to, in any period, including what we call Nehruvian socialism, what we call the license Raj, the Indiran license Raj, and the longest period of this history, or the half of the last 60 years are in what we call liberalization, what the corporate world, of which I was a part, I should say, refers to as the best period. It doesn't seem to make any difference. So we don't belong in this category, which is China at 12,500, Korea at 31,000, Japan at 40,000. We are at 2,000. Where do we belong? We belong with Bangladesh, 2,200, slightly ahead of us, but not by much. With Pakistan, 1,537. And with Sub-Saharan Africa, 1,501. But to go back to the premise, we, and certainly I, for many years have believed that we are headed for something which is quite special, that this is not our place. We are not bound by whatever fate South Asia is bound to. We are headed towards wherever Japan is, where China has reached, where Korea reached in the 80s, where Taiwan reached in the 70s, where the West reached in the 50s and 60s. The question is why we believe that. And to my mind, I don't know the answer to that. Looking at the data, it's quite clear to me that the children, when we leave this hall and we go down to our cars and we go home, the poor we see on the road will remain poor till they die. The children who tap on the windows of our cars will remain poor till they die. This will not change. This will not change because the structure of the economy, no matter what philosophy runs it, socialism, capitalism, nepotism, whatever you want to call it, doesn't seem to change the growth pattern. This is who we are, this is the level of the growth we are. And surprisingly, this is where most of the world is. Most of the world is a world of failed economies. Most of the world fails. Very few nations actually succeed in economic terms. Almost no nation, with the very few exceptions like the three nations I've named, China, Japan, South Korea, actually do the sort of economic miracle that they have done um, uh, in the last 60 years. The history of the world, economically, no matter what form of government you have, is a history of failure. The per capita GDP growth of India in decadal terms now, this is in a percentage, 4% in the 60s, 3% in the 70s, 5.5% in the 80s, 5.6% in the 90s, 6.7% in the aughts, the 2001 to 2010 period, 5.12% in the last 10 years, including what we call New India and so on. That you've got your great sort of economic reforms and whatever changes have been put in place in the last 8 years have produced 5.12% growth. Japan, Korea, and China at their peak for a whole decade were growing at 15%. And I don't know, for many of us who are not accustomed to the idea of exponential growth, the difference between 5% and 15% might not seem that much. It's just 1:3. But what it results in is the sort of numbers that I took you through, that we were behind China in 1990. Today they are 6 times ahead of us and show no sign of reducing that gap that they have opened up with us. What are we doing about it? I think that is, to my mind, something we should take a look at. And here I'll turn to the idea of the state and what states do to be able to transform themselves as nations. So what did Pakistan do when it became independent? Pakistan felt two things. Firstly, that in an undivided India, Muslims would not get representation based on the population that they had, rightly or wrongly. Secondly, there was a positive idea to the fact that they would bring in religion into the state. And Liaquat Ali Khan says in the Constituent Assembly, this is 3 or 4 years after Hiroshima. And he says that mankind, that science has run ahead of man's moral and spiritual nature. That what man and woman, humans, ought to be doing in the world is touched more by the negative aspect. And the reason he felt was that science was not, in some way, science and modernity were not touched by faith. That the moral element to man was brought into the species essentially through faith. And so what Pakistan would do, it would combine these two elements, and it would bring in faith into the population and make the body of the people fit for purpose for the modern world. Not only would they be modern, not only would they be scientific, but they would also have an ethical and moral stature which the rest of the world would not have. This proved a little difficult to convert into law. So for those of you who have read Pakistani history, for 10 years they didn't have a constitution. So they had these internal struggles where there was a power balance shift between the Bengalis, who were a large part of the population, and the Punjabis in the West, and the wealthy, aristocratic people from UP and Bihar who had moved from India. So in that struggle, there was no real constitution. Then the army takes over and stays in power till Bangladesh happens. During this period, Pakistan says that it will essentially try to aim its religious laws at Muslims, not at non-Muslims. They say non-Muslims have got nothing to fear. What we will do with the state is that we will make sure that Muslims become better Muslims. How will it do that? Pakistan will do this by enforcing the codes that it sees in the faith. That if the idea is that fasting is important in a month of the year, it will enforce fasting. How can you enforce fasting? You will shut down restaurants in the daytime. You will make sure that nobody eats in that period, and you sort of police that mechanism, that you use force to make sure that people are not seen to be eating, and restaurants and cinema theaters are shut in that period. That if there is an obligation to pay a tithe, what is called zakat, this will be debited from the fixed deposit accounts on one day of the year when Ramzan comes around, and that money will go to the state and it will be disbursed to the poor as alms and charity, which is what the instruction is. That we will bring in corporal punishment. That the idea is South Asia, if you go to Dhaka or if you go to Chittagong, if you go to Peshawar or Lahore or Karachi, and you say 420, 302, they know what that means. 144, they know what that means. Because since 1860s, the 1860s, the subcontinent has been ruled by a code of laws that Macaulay left us, which is called the Indian Penal Code. It's unchanged. So except for a very few things, very minor things actually, I should say, it's exactly the same. The law is the same in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because it was an effective law that the police knew and the population was familiar with. New Pakistan said that it would change this by bringing in Islamic punishment, which would be, for theft, you would chop off the hand at the wrist. If you thieved again, you would lose another limb, your leg, on the opposite side. And it trained a series of surgeons to do this. So there were surgeons who were trained in hospitals on how to most humanely amputate hands and feet. Pakistan's judges were trained in common law, just like ours, and they refused to pass these sentences. So while these sentences remained on the book, nobody in Pakistan has ever lost his or her hand or foot because of this. No, not even one person. The punishment for fornication was to be stoned to death. Nobody in Pakistan has ever been stoned to death. The law remains on the book. They tried to make themselves better as a society, but were not able to do this through the new laws that they actually produced. On zakat, what happened was that first the Shia said that we give our tithe directly. So the Shia have an organized clergy, unlike the Sunni. Pakistan can never be a theocratic state because it doesn't have an organized set of clerics like Iran does, which is a proper theocracy. The Shia said, we can't be a part of this. We are a different sect, faith, if you will. And they were actually exempted, and their bank accounts were not actually debited then. Following that, many Sunnis started to claim that they were Shia, so that their bank accounts were not debited. Towards the end, what happened was, knowing when that day would come, people would withdraw their money from the fixed deposit so that the state didn't have any agency to debit what was there. There was not that much money. And that remains the case. It's a problem that you have a law that people want to follow, that the state believes will make the nation a better place, but the population doesn't want it. The owners of restaurants and of cinema halls, many of them Gujaratis, I should say, in Karachi, Gujarati Muslims, said that this idea of enforcing fasting is not right. And they're right, that it's not there. You can't actually enforce it. Also, many non-Muslims would be harassed because of the fact that it was not possible for the Pakistani citizen to identify visually who is a Muslim and who is not a Muslim, and seeing somebody not fasting and eating in the middle of the day was felt to be offensive, and they would be beaten up and assaulted often. So these laws failed. Under Musharraf, about 2 decades ago, or decade and a half ago, some of these laws were returned back from the Sharia into the penal code, a secularization of the law. So on fornication, the law was brought back into the penal code. Many of the laws where there was penal power to the police on what is called Sharia was returned back to the police under penal code, a secularization of the process of law. I will turn to India. That given what the state knows, the data that the World Bank gives us and what we can access on its website, it's sent by the state in India. The government of India knows that it has grown at this pace. It knows that it's growing slightly slower than Bangladesh, slightly faster than Pakistan, slightly faster than sub-Saharan Africa, very much slower than nations in East Asia, nowhere close to being a developed world, no chance of getting there in 2040. If we grow at this pace, in 2047, 25 years from now, what is called the end of Amrit Kal, we will be behind where China is today, significantly behind, assuming we grow at this pace. The history of manufacturing, the history of industry does not give us the hope that this will continue to be the case, that we will have the growth rates that we had in the past continue into the future, because it's slightly problematic. And maybe I'll come to that later. What we've done, just like Pakistan said that it would become a better state by excluding, by first trying to make its Muslims better, but then going after its minorities, is something we've done here as well. After the Pakistani experiment of trying to make Muslims better began to not succeed, I won't use the word fail, what happened was that the attention of the state turned towards the minorities. That first, by law, they said that no Muslim could be the president, the head of state. Then by law, they said that no Muslim could be the prime minister. This is written into the constitution. Then, I'm so sorry, no non-Muslim may be. Then by law, in 1973, Second Amendment, Bhutto apostatized a sect of Muslims who remain apostatized today. And because of the conditions that are on the Pakistani passport, this sect, I won't name them, have neither the ability to participate in the voting process, nor, unless they are willing to disown their faith, get a passport. So the conditions for getting a passport require these people to disown their faith. And this is a fairly significant sect. It comes from Punjab and fairly well off, but has been persecuted for the last 50 years. In India, what happened was that we didn't need the law to exclude. So if you look at India today in 2022, there is no Muslim in the cabinet. There are roughly about 200 million. We don't know what the size of the Muslim population is in India because we haven't conducted a census in the last 11 years. For the first time in a century, in more than a century, we haven't conducted the census because of reasons that we need not go into. For the first time, we have a ruling party with a full majority, 303 Lok Sabha MPs, no non-Muslim. The last Lok Sabha, 282 Lok Sabha MPs, zero Muslim. The only cabinet in South Asia today that includes a member of the largest minority is today in Bangladesh. So while Bangladesh constitutionally has Bismillah as the opening of its a preamble, it is actually more secular in many ways than India and Pakistan. It doesn't have the discrimination built in into law or into practice. Law in terms of Pakistan, practice in terms of India, that the other two states have. So 303 MPs, no Muslim, 282 MPs, no Muslim. In 15 states in India, there is no Muslim minister. In 10 states in India, there is one Muslim minister, normally given a minority affairs. So it's the sort of, you throw the scrap and say that this is where you are. What applies to Muslims in India doesn't apply to other communities. So my caste, what is called the Patidar community, we dominate the cabinet in Gujarat and have dominated for decades. Though we are not a majority of the population. We are not even a significant plurality. We are probably about 15% or so. But Muslims may only win seats in India where they are a full majority. They will not be given tickets otherwise. We don't consider them, by we I mean the party system and perhaps the voter as well, in the same way that we segment the other voters, that they are only allowed to hang on to seats that they can win on the strength of their own community. So while law says in Pakistan that no non-Muslim may become a prime minister, there's no such law in India, but it's not needed. It is inconceivable, to me at least, that we will see a Muslim elected as the popular leader in India. I think I was quite shocked when Obama came to the presidency, but then I didn't know what the nature of the caucus system was and the primary system was, and maybe there was something there. But I don't think it is imaginable for us in 2022 that you see a non-Muslim becoming prime minister in Pakistan and a Muslim becoming prime minister in India. So the exclusion, whether it's through law or through policy, is total. After 2018, interfaith marriage has been banned in 7 states here, including Karnataka. And this has 2 elements to it. The first is, if a Hindu wants to marry a Muslim, they have to apply to the government 30 days in advance, fill out a form. It's the district collector or the magistrate who will determine whether the marriage will go ahead. If he or she finds that there is coercion involved in the marriage, the word coercion is fairly vague and not really defined in law, the marriage can be undone, including marriages that have children. The state retains the power, the authority. This is the new law. It can undo a marriage which has children. The testimony of an adult woman that she converted of free volition. This is a very conservative part of the world. You don't marry and go into somebody's family and retain your own faith. The understanding is, it might not be the case for many of us here, but for most Indians, the idea is that you become part of that family's culture. And by culture, we mean faith. The idea, the state says, if it finds that there is coercion, it will not accept the adult woman's testimony. It doesn't count. It will ask the family she is married into and the man she is marrying whether or not they coerced her, and based on the testimony they give, the state will determine whether or not to undo the marriage. 7 states in India after 2018. We know about the exclusion of the Muslim from CAA. We know about what the Home Minister said about the National Register of Citizens, that it's a pincer, that the CAA will filter out all the others except one community, then the NRC will come and get them. So as and when that law comes, if it comes, that's what it's aiming for. India criminalized, the only part of India to have a civil act, which is divorce, criminalized is the Muslim community. So in 2017, I think it was August, the Supreme Court invalidated the offering of triple talaq in one sitting. So Muslim divorce works in this fashion, that if the word talaq is offered between 3 menstrual cycles with no intercourse in the middle, it's valid and remains valid even now. If it's offered together in one sitting, it's invalid. That's what the Supreme Court said, and therefore, if offered after August 2017, the marriage remained intact. 2 years after that, in 2019, Parliament criminalized the uttering of those words. What that means is, if a Hindu man were to be accused of saying to his wife these 3 words, it would not be an offense and it would not be a divorce. If a Muslim man were to be accused of saying this to his wife, they would not be a divorce because it's invalid, but it would be a crime. The accusation would make it a crime, though there is no offense, there is no divorce. They are the only part of the population for which this is true. Beef lynching as a category of violence came to us after 2015. So as a journalist, I've been familiar with the headlines for many years, and I worked in newspapers for a couple of decades. This is a new category of violence that, while lynching is not new in India and will not be new and will remain with us, unfortunately, for some time, The idea that we kill people or we assault them because of the belief that they have this meat in their fridge or their van, this is new. And it came after 2015 because two states, Maharashtra first, and then Haryana second, and now there are 5 more states. They criminalized the possession of beef with the reversal of burden of proof. So just like the woman's testimony doesn't count, the state doesn't have to prove that the meat in your fridge is beef. You have to prove it. Common law, we are the jurisprudence we have in South Asia is called common law, which comes to us from the English. And it says that there is what is axiomatic is that you are innocent until proven guilty. It's reversed both on marriage, interfaith marriage, where the woman's testimony doesn't count, reversed also on beef. In 2019, a court in Gujarat sentenced a man, Muslim man obviously, to 10 years in jail after he was accused of serving beef at his daughter's wedding. It's been reported by the Indian Express. It's a pretty good story, in case you want to Google it later. The police could not prove. They said that we sent some samples, I don't know what samples they were, to the Forensic Sciences Laboratory. The lab sent its results back saying, we don't know what this is. Court convicted the man, saying it's not for the state to prove. The law says you have to prove that this was not beef. The meat consumed all those weeks before, you come and show us that this is not beef. He could not, 10 years in jail. The High Court reversed this conviction on discretion. I don't know what this doctrine is, but I think the judge was embarrassed that this was happening in India. But the fact is that in the part of the judiciary that has the power to sentence you, this is normal. That they will send you to jail, and this is what the law says. Why should the judge not follow the law? If the law says that you should do it, the judge will do it. In Gujarat, cattle slaughter is, so basically Hindus, we did what the Muslims did in Pakistan, but we did it slightly deviously. So we wanted a ban on cow slaughter, but we didn't want to say this was because it was religiously offensive to us. We said it's because of the fact that we have weak children who need milk, and so we need more cows. And we also had some element of subterfuge and said that, because at some point people said, okay, why not the bullocks then? There's no use for them, given the fact that you use the tractor. So the court said, no, we need them because manure is really valuable, and the cow is like a moving factory. That's what the Supreme Court of India said. So it's an economic crime. No other economic crime in India draws life. In Gujarat, cattle slaughter, life in prison. If you steal 10,000 crores from a bank, not going to get life in prison. The man, I forget the name, Satyam, he's out. He didn't get life. You will not get life, Raju, yes. So what we've done is we've used our laws in a sort of roundabout way to try and fix the minorities in exactly the same way as the rest of South Asia has done, but we've pretended we've done this under the carapace of this secular state. Gujarat has a law which was amended in 2020, which essentially ghettoizes Muslims permanently. What it says is, if a Hindu and Muslim are either buying or leasing property between themselves, they have to apply to the state, and the state will determine whether that sale will go through or the lease will go through. You have to declare your faith on an affidavit. All the cities of Gujarat, including my city, Surat, it's called Ashant Dharo. In 2020, the law was amended and tightened further. The state can undo sales and leases if it feels there is improper clustering. That is what the law says, quote, improper clustering of certain communities. It doesn't want certain communities in certain parts of the city. What it means, in essence, is that foreigners can lease and buy land and flats in Gujarat cities where Gujarati Muslims cannot. The law comes up for renewal every 3 years and it's passed automatically, especially after the BJP came to power there in the late 90s. There's not been much debate. Lastly on this, Uh, India seems to me to have democratized in many ways violence against minorities. That there is a fundamental rule of modern government, which is that the state controls a monopoly over violence. That the police has a lathi in his hand or a gun on his holster because he's authorized to use it. I'm not carrying a lathi and I don't have a gun and I can't use it because I don't have the right by law to be able to use it against somebody else. That the state controls force. You can't do it. You can argue with your neighbor, you can't shoot him. Not that it stops people in Noida and so on, but by law, the principle of modern government is that the monopoly, only the state can use violence, not the rest of us. I think we have let that go. That where the state has given, there are lakhs, tens of lakhs of Muslim men from northern India who work in the national capital region, far from Ghaziabad and Farrukhabad and wherever they come from, who live in tenements and chawls, who don't have access to a mosque, applied to the state to get some space, government-owned, public land, where they can come on Friday and do congregational prayer. State said yes. Mobs turned up week on week, you know this from last year, and stopped it. The mobs forced the state to reverse. The state gave the permission. They were there on authorized land that they had the permission to pray in. The mob came and vetoed it. The state was unable to exercise force and said, okay, you win. Similarly, I think what we've seen in many parts of the country, including in Gujarat, where this happens fairly normally and regularly and has been happening for decades, economic boycotts and so on, mobs coming and banning women from wearing what they want to, including college, including principals and teachers, adult women in this state who can't wear what they want because they believe that there is a ban on covering their head. So there is a democratization of that violence against minorities that I think will be difficult to rein in. I'll make two more points and then I'll close. I'll return to what I began with on the economic side. So in one of my books, I've looked at what the last few years have been like. And I should say that I don't think that this is, to my mind, the fault of either the state in large measure or any party. This is where we are. 5 crore fewer Indians have jobs today than they had in 2014. In absolute numbers. 12 crore more people came into the workforce, meaning they've turned 15 or more. But 5 crore fewer people are actually working today. The labor force participation rate in India is the lowest in South Asia. It's close to Somalia's. It's 40%. To understand what 40% means, in the US, it's more than 60%. In Vietnam and China, it's more than 70%. The labor force participation rate of women in India is lower than that in Bangladesh. It's amongst the lowest in the world. This is one reason why we are not able to put, it's not the only reason, but it's one reason why we are not able to be the kind of economy that Korea became, that China has become, that Japan became first. And there is a structural social problem here that doesn't appear to be soluble. The number of women working in the workforce proportionally has fallen in the last 20 years, not risen. Jobs in manufacturing have halved in the last 7 years. If all these three nations, when they were able to double and triple their GDP growth over a decade, the one way that they did it was to send their produce abroad. Exports was the basis of their growth because you can't grow your own economy by 10 and 15% a year. You need to make stuff that the rest of the world wants to buy. India's share of the manufacturing share of GDP has fallen since 2014 from 16% to 14%. Government data. There is no dispute over this. We might not be talking about it, but there is no dispute over this. All that I'm telling you comes from the government itself. Jobs in agriculture, according to the government, this is the a periodic labor force survey, for the first time since Nehru died, increased. The number of people working in agriculture increased over the number of people working in manufacturing and services. Some economists believe that this is disguised unemployment, that somebody who's left his job in the city has gone back to the village, and when the surveyor comes, says, "What do you do?" He says, "Nahi, main to khet mein kaam karta hu." He's not really working. There's no work. Could be wrong, could be right. Even if it's right, we are reversing the pattern of modernization. We are sending people out of factories and to the farms, to very small farms. The size of farms in India is not very big. 60% of India, and for some reason we seem to take pride in this. I don't know why we should be proud of this fact. 80 crore Indians have to line up every month and have been lining up for 30 months now for 5 kilos of wheat or rice and 1 kilo of dal. Consider this. Would you line up for something you didn't need? Most of us would not. This is not about rich and poor. You line up for something you need. And lining up in India, facing the government, facing the bureaucracy is not easy. So you're doing this because you need that. You need that grain. 60% dependent on free grain every month. I looked at 53 global indices. So Niti Aayog, 3 years ago, said that it was trying to improve India's rankings on all of these indices. So then they said, okay, we'll make some, whatever, some microsites and some other tech stuff, Bangalore stuff, But we could not. We kept falling. So now what we are doing is we are discrediting, saying that, no, the data is bad, this is wrong. But on 49 out of 53 indices, India has fallen since 2014. Across the spectrum. You look at governance, the economy, and these are indices coming out of the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, conservative institutions like the Economist, think tanks in the US that are quite right-wing, that we would normally like to associate ourselves with, or at least this government. But now we are disowning it, saying that it's bad. Lastly, the share of what is called a crony sector wealth, what is extractives, what the state can give you. I can make as a Bangalorean, somebody here may make an app or a service that makes her a lot of money. That's not the crony sector. The crony sector is extractives, stuff that comes out of the land that the government controls and gives a contract to. Oil, coal, other mining, spectrum, airports indeed, ports. The crony sector share in GDP in 2016 was 3% of a GDP. In 2021, it's 8%. This is The Economist, the most conservative financial publication that one can think of. So having looked at what we've done since 1960, this is what we are doing. We are doing two things. One is the focus of the state, of large parts of the media, and to my mind also large parts of the population, is on how we can torture minority Indians in more efficient ways and new ways daily. And on the side of actual progress in terms of the economy, in human development, we've done nothing. To repeat the figures, we are at 5% GDP growth for the last 10 years. We are exactly the same as we were during Indira's time or Rajiv's time and the rest of it. Final point, speaking to the subject of the talk. What does the individual do given this? I think the most important thing is to know what it is that we are going through. I think that the idea of absorbing material from news is less important than looking at it through the historical frame and lens, which to my mind is decadal, if not centurial. That you look at India today and compare it to where it was in 1960 rather than uh, where it was last year or last quarter, and look at it compared to the states that we want to emulate, at least in terms of the economy. Certainly, we don't want to emulate China in many other ways. We do want to emulate them on the side of the economy. That's the first thing we can do. We can arm ourselves with the knowledge that we know where this country stands, where it has come from, and that we're not that different from our sisters in Dhaka and in Karachi, while we may believe that we are. There's very little difference. It's very marginal. We are slightly behind Bangladesh, slightly ahead of Pakistan. Somebody looking at us from another country, certainly somebody looking at us from Mars, would not be able to tell the difference. Secondly, there are laws that the Constitution gives us that are not fully used by the citizenry for good reason. The reason is that the state doesn't want us to use them. So a fundamental right is a right that enjoys a high degree of protection from encroachment by the state. I have those freedoms, and those freedoms I have enjoy a high degree of protection from the encroachment by the government of Karnataka, by my local police station, or by the government of India. What are these? So that's what fundamental right means. Article 19 sits in the fundamental rights. It's a fundamental right for Indians to have peaceful assembly. This is a fundamental right. The police cannot come here and say that you cannot have this because this is our fundamental right. We can tell them to get lost, but it's difficult. To organize a gathering in most parts of India, including in Bangalore, in public, requires you to apply to a police station to say, we are going to gather here peacefully, may we gather? The right is with the police. They reserve the right to say yes, no, or they reserve the right not to reply to you, in which case you can't go ahead. We wanted something, by we I mean the organization that I work for, wanted to have something in support of the Rohingya community at town hall. And we wanted Ram Guha to come and speak. And I went to meet the commissioner and he said, no. He said, it's dangerous. I said, are you worried Guha will bore the people to death? Because I think that was the biggest danger there, that he will speak for 90 minutes and, people. But this is it. The right actually doesn't reside with us. If you go to the West, you'll see small gatherings, 4 people, 5 people, with placards outside offices, outside government offices, police stations, malls. We don't want this, we don't like this. You can't do that here. They'll just put you in the van. So it's a fundamental right, but the right doesn't reside with us. We need to take that back. We need to have the ability to gather peacefully because it's a fundamental right. Freedom of expression, also Article 19, exists on paper, doesn't exist really in practice for 2 reasons. One is the law, that India has criminalized free speech through criminal defamation, criminal contempt, sedition, 153A, other laws, which make it difficult for us to speak on things that are seen to be offensive. That's one part. The second part is just mob violence. The fear of the mob and the fact that the state will not step in and you'll be beaten up for saying something means that most people will not say something. I think this is more true today in 2022 than it was 10 years ago. That we have become a less tolerant society about what we can hear. And because of that, we've become a less expressive society. We need to claw that back as well. A man here from Bangalore spent a month in jail for putting up on his Twitter account a still from a movie 35 years old. Mohammed Zubair. The Supreme Court had to give him bail. In the US Supreme Court doesn't hear bail matters. And the constitutional courts of the West don't hear bail matters. Here the problem is because the poison has spread so deep into society, it has infected not just the state but also large parts of the judiciary, that it becomes difficult for a comic to come out of jail because the judge says he should remain in that, even though he's not said the joke he was supposed to have said, It's bizarre. The last one is freedom of association, that we have criminalized it through the banning of organizations, through the freezing of accounts, through the demonization of groups, using laws on funding to make sure that groups that work on subjects that the state doesn't want discussed don't work. And I think in that sense, we are not particularly democratic in having the ability to tolerate organizations, communities, and voices that we are not fully aligned with. The sign of a good, robust democracy is, in the first instance, the fact that it has churn and emotion without violence. I think that produces a sort of energy that a lot of the more successful non-Asian states have had. My last point is that things will get better. That if you look at history in historical terms, everything that I've spoken about has worked out in only one way for most states that have tackled them. If you look at the world of 1860, where you've got a world with slavery legalized in the wealthiest nation, even then, it's gone. If you look at wars reduced to a very large extent, if you look at colonialism gone almost fully, rights of women, the right to vote, the right to women over their own bodies, gay rights, it's very difficult to think of things on which what we consider to be the liberal left has ceded space or lost. It has taken the field each time. But we need to look historically on this as not a quarterly or yearly thing, as I said, but over a longer period, which doesn't mean that the individuals sit back and let it happen. It only happens when large numbers of people or small numbers of people put their hand up and push back in any way they can after having understood where it is that their nation stands. Thank you very much once again for all of you for coming and listening to me so patiently.
2 points. I have a comment and a question. I am under the impression that Hindus do not accept conversion from Islam to Hinduism, while the other way it is allowed. Hindu can convert to a Muslim. And I believe in Kashmir, that is what happened. Buddhists could not convert to Hinduism, so most of the people became Muslims. That's my impression. That is one. And do you think the response of majority to minority is a result of the radical Islam that is spreading in the world? And it's been provoked. You know, a bit like anti-communism movement started by the US because they thought communism would take over the world.
I think that's a good question. I think it's quite similar to what happened in the US, that Edward R. Murrow and people like him were able to shut down this kind of ghostly, mythical communist threat because it didn't really exist. Similarly, if you look at hard data on the number of incidents of violence here in this country, according to the government data, which look at what is called Islamist violence, 99% of it has been in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where it is essentially between what we call militants or terrorists and the state. Outside of it, it's very hard to think of any violence. It's a ghost that is floated, I think, by the middle class, which has not much else to do once it comes back from the office. In terms of data, it's very hard to see if that's true or not. On Kashmir, once again, I would say that on conversion, there is nothing stopping. So Article 25, thank you for raising this subject, is one of those other frauds that Hindus have put on. So the Christians specifically went to the Constituent Assembly to say that conversion is an article of my faith. There's a man called Frank Anthony, he runs some schools, not from, he was Anglo-Indian. So he went to the Constituent Assembly, told them that my community does not convert because we are born Anglos. But the Christians want the right to propagate because it's an article of faith. They believe that their faith requires them to spread the word of Jesus and to try and convince people to accept it. The faith requires it. The Constituent Assembly accepted it. They said yes. Ambedkar in his draft puts in the word converts instead of propagates. When the word propagates is used, does not raise an objection on the assumption, which is absolutely right, that the debates make it clear that the two words are the same. We took that away from them. India is a very strange place where the right to the Article 25 the right to propagate is both a criminal act and a fundamental right. So the government is telling you, please use this freedom. Go and propagate your faith. The moment you do it, they say, come to jail. So this is the kind of game that we play. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, Aakar, I want to ask you this anarchist cookbook. Did you talk about all the things that are in
I
there?
have spoken about the laws. I haven't spoken about. So basically, people think that activism is a bunch of people who, wear a certain kind of garment and sort of often don't bathe and then come out with them, which is true to a large extent. But I'm saying that there is a technical side to activism which I learned in my years with Amnesty. So just as when we go to a white collar job and we are taught systems, the way that activism works is very technical. And I don't think the layperson understands. I did not till I joined the organization. And I felt it important to communicate what I had learned from all those young people that I worked with. And so it contains in large measure some of the things I spoke of, but what I did not speak of today was how.
Two questions.
Yes, sir.
Your closing optimistic comment that things will get better. I don't know if you really believe that, because I think those who are at the back of what's going on think it's just begun. And there's a long way to go before we change the constitution and let me finish and make it complete. This is just the beginning. That is one. Second is, I think for me and for many others and people outside India, what's surprising is the degree of acceptance there is within the community, in the Indian society, to what's going on, the total violation, the violence, the illegalities in the political class particularly. I think many people in the world are quite amazed that this ancient civilization puts up with this kind of nonsense.
So I'll make 3 points. One is that the idea of Indian exceptionalism, we should discard it. That we are exactly the same as Pakistanis, we are the same as Bangladesh. What happens there happens here. We are sisters. We are not different from them. Second thing, I think the world is surprised. One reason why CAA has not been implemented on the ground. The main reason is very, very clearly the very brave protest led by Muslims, particularly Muslim women. But the European Parliament drafted a motion extremely condemnatory of this country. Rightly so. Very, very, very tough language. Jaishankar flew to Brussels and said, okay, you've tabled the motion, don't vote on it. We don't know what he offered as a compromise. I suspect, I could be wrong because this is not a transparent government and they don't tell us why they do or don't do things. I suspect that the reason why CA has not been implemented more than 2 years after it was passed, on 2019, yes, almost 3 years, is because of the fact that the world said that this is not the India we know. This is not the India we know. Kashmiri children are the only part of the world to spend the pandemic without access to education. No internet in Kashmir, 17 months. Why was it? It was lifted 7 days after the Biden administration came to office. There was in December 2019, in the US Congress, there's this woman called Pramila Jayapal. She wrote a very condemnatory note on Kashmir. Jaishankar went to Washington, refused to meet her. Within a week of the Democrats taking office, net was lifted. Only part of the world to have no access to telemedicine, 17 months, the entire pandemic. And the first thing you said, we don't have that much agency anymore. The world is moving. What were the conditions under which Kashmir acceded to the Union? One is foreign affairs will be part of the Union. Communications will be with the Union. What communications does the state control today? It's not telegram and post office and railways, right? When we speak to our relatives and our friends, we use WhatsApp, we use video chat. The state has no control over it. Similarly, I think that the idea of humanity being confined to nation states, to linguistic blocks, races, and I'm not being a romantic here, I hope, will not stay for long. And we don't have that much sort of agency, particularly those parts of the world which can't feed their own. If you've got the labor force participation rate of 40%, you're headed towards where the Mughal Empire was in the late 1600s. that you don't have enough, state doesn't have enough resource to run a country of 1.4 billion. It doesn't. You don't have an economy that size. You go bust. And since we live in this very capitalist world, it might be a good thing that you go bust and then, like, something new comes from it.
Is it in your opinion that the public was already thinking in a majoritarian way, and that resulted in the BJP government getting elected and being what they are? Or do you think that the public gets influenced by those in power and sort of gets converted to some degree to thinking this way? And the reason I ask is that I was teaching some MBA students in the 80s and 90s. Till 91, almost everyone said, it's good for the state to control industry and be socialistic and so on. After 91, every student said the opposite. So there's some...
Let me give you an example from, we can always blame the neighbor and say that we are who we are because of you. So in undivided India, there were 7 cases of blasphemy. I forget the exact, the IPC, I think it's 193, I could be mistaken. Whoever commits an act of blasphemy or disrespect somebody's faith gets 3 years in jail. So Periyar, Naikar, took a statue of Ganesha and smashed it in the town hall.
I know.
This was 1923, I could be mistaken about the year. Judge acquits him. Indian judge. It was the Raj, but the judge was an Indian. Between the time that the law is drafted and the mid-80s in undivided India, all of India and Pakistan, there are 7 cases of blasphemy registered. Zia-ul Haq makes the punishment, takes that IPC, the same law that we have, makes the punishment first life and then death. That if you are accused of blasphemy, Gustaq-e-Rasool, that's the law name, death for you. The number of cases filed goes into the thousands. About half of the people accused are from the minority communities, who are 3 or 4% of the country's population. So you're using the state, you're using legislation, you're using the frenzy of division to stoke it. It didn't exist in the population. Go back to what you asked. It was not inherently there. It may have been there in some nascent form. It was stoked, deliberately set on fire. So I would say exactly the same thing applies here. That what we call the riot in India, why is it episodic? Why does it happen in 84, then in 2002, then in 1993 and so on? It happens when elements of the state, whether in the opposition or whether in power, use the opportunity to mobilize around division and hate. And it's a very effective way to mobilize. B, the size of the state in India is very small, not able to control. And that produces the violence. So.
Can I? In your closing comments, Mr. Patel, you are optimistic. What is the source of this optimism? Because the Haridwar Dharma Sansad gave a genocidal call not very long ago, just before the Uttarakhand went to polls. And those people are still out. In fact, instead of hauling them up for the genocidal call that they made, on some gender issue, they were put behind the bars and came out on bail very, very quickly. Then you have the case of the member of parliament himself asking for boycotting of the community, and the hate speech galore all around us. Then there is the Prayagraj session of the Dharma Sansad, which is already supposed to have made the part 1 of the new constitution for Hindu Rashtra, where they would even probably declare Varanasi as the capital of the country and things like that. Now the genie is out of the bottle. Now how do you make this kind of an optimistic comment towards the end of your speech? This is really, I'm really curious to know.
I don't look at the episodes that you described, which rightly point to where we are today, I'm not talking about that. I recognize the state in which this country is. I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think we are in a poorer state today than we were, say, 25 years ago. And one reason for that is the accommodation by the state of the violence. And by state, I mean the government, that we did not have, in the past, at least some words were offered by the state to say that what is happening is wrong. Today, not only is it the case that the state is okay with what goes on, it could be argued, and I think successfully, that the state stokes it. The issue is whether this is sustainable. That is where the optimism comes in. That you cannot have something which fails at the level of the economy, fails at the level of society, and expect it to last. There is nothing there. It's hollow. That's the problem with it. Once you remove the venom, what remains in it? Is there, forget 15%, is there 10% growth? Is there the idea that the lives of those who are on the street and we will meet today after we leave this, is there any hope that it will get better in 5 or 10 years? Do they have that hope? Do we think that they should have that hope? If the answer to that is no, it can't be sustained. The idea of tolerance, which this great civilization has, also extends to the fact that we are okay with things being very bad for a very long period of time. But historically speaking, that's not how it works. You will have to face the consequences of failure. And I think that what we are doing today has already produced failure. I'll take maybe one more question.
Hi, Aakar. I'm Ritvik. We have had a few exchanges on Twitter where you even suggested a shop to buy sandals as well. So a very interesting lecture where you have talked about the threat to an individual and individualism in this sort of an authoritarian state. And towards the end, you spoke about, arming ourselves with knowledge. The more we know, the better equipped we are to dealing with this. What I felt was missing from your lecture was the cyber aspect of this. Things like Pegasus. I keep getting robocalls, like I got like 3 robocalls right now. And having friends in the cybersecurity industry, I know that most of these robocalls are attempting to implant spywares like Pegasus onto my phone. But fortunately, I'm using a graphene, which has come forward because of the works of Amnesty International in exposing spywares like Pegasus. There's also another OS called Calyx. So the more people know about this, it's better for them. So what do you think people should need to do in order to equip ourselves from this cyberspace threat to an individual? And what are the other steps that we need to take?
Actually, at the most basic level, we should question and resist the imposition of Aadhaar. I think that the targeting by the state through Pegasus is very narrow and on very few, and it's extremely expensive. So it's not as if the state can pay the license fees for the entire population. It can't. But I think what the state has done through Aadhaar is dangerous. It doesn't have any element of accountability. And I don't think the state fully understands what it's doing as well. So I think it's the one thing that the individual can do in terms of activism here is to push back against the imposition of Aadhaar and the linking of such things as the voter ID card and so on. And I think that these small measures, including being active on social media, including making sure that your phone is secure, are the sorts of things that I'm talking about. That we should be active, we should not be passive. We should assume that we are part of a society where things are happening, and we should try and do whatever it is we can as individuals in whatever small way. I think the key to a society's progress and to betterment is the fact that people like you have the awareness and want to act. Thank you once again very much to all of you, to the Trust, and I'd like to invite you back, please. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dear friends, on behalf of Bangalore International Center and the Vijay Nambisan Trust, I would like to thank Aakar Patel for having given us this very honest portrayal of where India is today in comparison to the rest of the world. And he has given us some depressing news, some optimistic points as well. But the 2 important things I would take away from his talk are one, that what we have seen in the last few years, which have shocked many of us, might get worse before they get better. And definitely, all of us will have to face the consequences. And the second point is that for it to get better, every one of us has to play a role, and we have to push back against oppression, and while keeping our faith alive that humanity is always wired to goodness, and that it will finally triumph, but it needs hard work. And I would really encourage all of you to, those of you who haven't read Aakar Patel, to pick up some of his books and read and find out more details about what he has spoken. I'm extremely grateful to all of you for having come here and participated in this event. Thank you very much.